talking about existing systems as being future technology, or veil their comments so that only the select few will see the deeper meaning. It is standard practice to produce an unclassified version that can be published publicly and a classified version that is more explicit or in many cases contradictory. In other words, often what is printed publicly are lies. Despite that practice, the public version of this very historical document contains the following revealing quotes by the authors. Quote, "In Vietnam, our psychological warfare failed because it was outmatched by the psyops of the enemy. Our psyop did not really change the minds of the enemy population, nor did it defend the U.S. population at home against the propaganda of the enemy. Furthermore, the enemy's psyop was so strong that it, not bigger armies or better weapons, overcame all of the weapons systems we fielded. The lesson is not to ignore our own psyop capability, but rather to change it and strengthen it so that it can do precisely that kind of thing to our enemy in the next war for the mind. Psychotronic research is in its infancy, but the U.S. Army already possesses an operational weapon system designed to do what Lieutenant Colonel J.B. Alexander would like ESP to do, except this weapon system uses existing communications media. It seeks to map the minds of the neutral and enemy individuals and then to change them in accordance with U.S. national interests. It must strengthen our national will to victory, and it must attack and ultimately destroy that of our enemy. It both causes and is affected by physical combat, but it is a type of war which is fought on a far more subtle basis as well in the minds of the national populations involved. If we do not so attack the enemy's will, until he reaches the battlefield, his nation will have strengthened it as best it can. We must attack that will before it is locked in place. We must instill in it a predisposition to inevitable defeat. Strategic mind war must begin the moment war is considered to be inevitable. It must seek out the attention of the enemy nation through every available medium, and it must strike at that nation's potential soldiers before they put on their uniforms. It is in their homes and their communities that they are most vulnerable to mind war. Was the U.S. defeated in the jungles of Vietnam, or was it defeated in the streets of American cities? In its strategic context, mind war must reach out to friends, enemies, and neutrals alike across the globe, neither through primitive battlefield leaflets and loudspeakers of PSYOP, nor through the weak, imprecise, and narrow efforts of psychotronics, but through the media possessed by the U.S., which have the capabilities to reach virtually all people on the face of the earth. For the mind is to believe in its own decision. It must feel that it made these decisions without coercion. Coercive measures used by the operative consequently must not be able to be detected by ordinary means. There is no need to resort to mind-weakening drugs, such as those explored by the CIA. In fact, the exposure of a single such method would do unacceptable damage to mind war's reputation for truth. It identifies purely psychological factors which suggest appropriate idioms for messages. Doctrine in this area is highly developed, and the task is basically one of assembling and maintaining individuals and teams with enough expertise and experience to apply the doctrine effectively. This, however, is only the sociological dimension of target receptiveness measures. There are some purely natural conditions under which minds may become more or less receptive to ideas, and mind war should take full advantage of such phenomenon as atmospheric electromagnetic activity, air ionization, and other natural conditions under which minds may become more or less receptive to ideas, and mind war should take full advantage of such phenomenon as atmospheric electromagnetic activity, air ionization, and extremely low frequency waves. If we do not accept Excalibur, then we relinquish our ability to inspire foreign cultures with our morality, If they then desire moralities unsatisfactory to us, we have no choice but to fight them on a more brutish level." End quote. The following footnote to ELF is included. Extremely low frequency waves. ELF waves are up to 100 Hz and are more naturally occurring, but they can also be produced artificially, such as the Navy's Project Sanguine for submarine communication. Extremely low frequency waves are not normally noticed by the unaided senses, yet their resonant effect upon the human body has been connected to both physiological disorders and emotional distortion. Infrasound vibration, up to 20 Hz, can subliminally influence brain activity to align itself to delta, theta, alpha, or beta waves, inclining an audience toward everything from alertness to passivity. Infrasound could be used tactically, as ELF waves endure for great distances, and it could be used in conjunction with media broadcasts as well. The footnote mentioned on ELF is fairly specific and admits that it is to be used in conjunction with television and radio. In short, the extremely low-frequency mind war attack signal will be piggybacked on a TV carrier wave to target civilian populations in their homes, to instill feelings of fear and terror prior to the start of a conflict. In short, shock and awe. The power of extremely low frequency to change the mood and thoughts of enemy populations was well understood by the U.S. PSYOP forces, and to General Aquino and Colonel Vallely as in particular. If these weapons were turned against friendly populations, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to detect their influence. Colonel Vallely holds many hard-right views on the Vietnam War, as well as aspects of American society that he would like to change. Now a Fox military analyst, he told Fox House liberal Alan Colmes that, quote, "We are not going to permit a Shia majority victory in the forthcoming theater of a free election in Iraq. Worse," he said, quote, "Iran and Syria are next. It's easy to do. Israel is already prepared to take Iran down," unquote. Colmes followed up by asking whether he thought a Judeo-Christian holy war against Muslims was such a great idea. Vallely replied, quote, "That's what's going on. If you don't understand that, then you don't get it," unquote. The women peace campers at Grenham Common, England, claimed that they were attacked by U.S. electromagnetic weapons from within the U.S. Air Base. Scientists from Electronics Today measured some form of electromagnetic wave that was responsible for the illnesses they suffered. A team of doctors from the Medical Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons compiled a report on the condition of the affected women. The women first noticed a pattern of illness emerging in 1984. Women at different points around the camp appeared to experience similar symptoms at the same time, even though they were not in contact with one another. Large numbers of women complained of sudden feelings of extreme tiredness shortly before major events, such as the departure of a cruise missile convoy. Readings taken with a wide-range signal strength meter showed marked increases in the background signal level near one of the women's camps at the time they claimed to be experiencing ill effects, including vertigo, retinal bleeding, burnt face even at night, nausea, sleep disturbances, palpitations, loss of concentration, loss of memory, disorientation, severe headaches, temporary paralysis, faulty speech coordination, irritability, and a sense of panic in non-panic situations, and in one case, a circulatory failure that required emergency treatment. Many of these symptoms have been associated in medical literature with exposure to microwaves, and especially through low-intensity or non-thermal exposure. These effects have been reviewed by Dr. Robert Becker, twice nominated for the Nobel Prize and a specialist in electromagnetic effects. His report confirms that the symptoms mirror those he would expect to see had microwave weapons been deployed. British defense officials have denied any form of electronic signal was being used against the protesters. The Department of Justice Electromagnetic Weapons Program. The Department of Defense uses the Department of Justice to develop and test non-lethal weapons as an aspect of deniability because many of these applications violate existing treaties. By using the Department of Justice and classifying these programs as crowd control, they are able to avoid scrutiny and can violate the spirit of the law without technically being in violation of international treaties. In 1993, the National Institute of Justice Initiative on Less Than Lethal Weapons recommended that state and local police departments in America utilize psychotronic, electromagnetic, and other mind control weapons against American citizens involved in, quote, domestic disturbances, an open-ended term that could include family arguments. The report said, quote, short-term research will be completed to adopt a military technology to use by domestic law enforcement, including laser, microwave, and electromagnetic weapons, unquote. The Washington Post reported, quote, the Pentagon and the DOJ have agreed to share state-of-the-art military technology with civilian law enforcement agencies, including exotic non-lethal weapons, unquote. This new approach to law enforcement was showcased in a 3-day secret conference on non-lethal weaponry at the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. The conference head was Colonel John B. Alexander, Program Manager for Non-Lethal Psychotronic Defense, Los Alamos National Laboratory. Attending the meeting was Attorney General Janet Reno, military weapons specialists, and representatives from state and local police departments. Subjects included radio frequency weapons, high-powered microwave technology, acoustic technology, voice synthesis, and application of extreme frequency electromagnetic fields to non-lethal weapons.
Question about some of the technology that you're developing to fight the war on terror, specifically directed energy and high-powered microwave technology. When do you envision that you can weaponize that type of technology?
Goodness, it is in, for the most part, the kinds of things you're talking about are in varying early stages. Do you have anything you'd add?
I don't think I would add much. I think they are in early stages and probably not ready for employment at this point.
In the normal order of things, when you invest in research and development and begin a developmental project, you don't have any intention or expectations that one would use it. On the other hand, the real world intervenes from time to time, and you reach in there and take something out that is still in a developmental stage, and you might use it. So your question's not answerable. It depends on what happens in the future and how well things move along the track, and whether or not someone feels it's appropriate to reach into a development stage and see if something might be useful, as was the case with the unmanned aerial vehicles.
But you sound like you're willing to experiment with it.
I think that's the point, and I think, we have, I think, from the beginning of this conflict, I think General Franks has been very open to looking at new things if there are new things available, and has been willing to put them into the fight even before they've been fully wrung out. And I think that's not referring to these two particular cases of directed energy or high-powered microwave, but sure.
Just the head was burned, and the other parts of the bodies wasn't anything that happened on it.
Al-Ghazali reported that he had seen 3 passengers in a car, all dead, with their faces and teeth burnt, the body intact, and no sign of projectiles.
There wasn't any bullet. I saw they teeth, just their teeth, and no eyes. All of them, with the body, nothing for the bodies. just the teeth and all the, the heads were burned.
There were other inexplicable aspects. The terrain where the battle took place was dug up by the American military and replaced with other fresh earth. The bodies that were not hit by projectiles had shrunk to just slightly more than 1 meter in height.
Except that the bodies is killed by the bullets. Most of them that become very small. It's like that, something like that.
Talk with the colleague Dr. Saad Al-Falluji, which is the chief surgeon in that hospital. Dr. Al-Falluji said me that from the survivors that he operated, that they said they did not hear any noise. So there was no explosion to hear, no metal fragments or shrapnels or bullets in the bodies. So they themselves were thinking of some strange kinds of weapon which they did not know.
No gunshot wounds?
No. I think, I don't know what it was really. We are here 10 surgeons. We couldn't decide what was the weapon which been hit this car.
But inside the bodies you did not discover ordinary bullets?
All of them we didn't find bullets.
Yeah.
We didn't find bullets. But most of the injured people been dead, so they took them immediately to the refrigerator. We couldn't dissect and see. But those who are alive, we couldn't find any kind of shells. We didn't find shells inside their body. Outside,
it seems to be a new weapon.
It seems a new weapon.
They try to do experiments on our civilian.
We don't know what was.
Nobody can identify what the type of this weapon.
26 in the past. About 20 of them. Some of them have no head. The head being cut. Some of them, the arms, the legs. The only one who didn't injure was the driver. And really, I don't know how he reached our hospital. Because one arm was in his lap. One head beside him. It was a very, very strange, horrible thing. In the roof of the car, there was part of the body, momentum, intestine, brains.
Yes, all parts of the body.
It was miserable. It was very, 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 very miserable.
I told them before.
Do you have idea with what kind of weapons they attacked that bus?
The bus, we didn't know what kind of weapon would be hit. Really, what we saw, cut arms, cut legs, cut head, abdomen, open abdomen.
In the early 1980s, during the Reagan administration, the United States and Britain, under Margaret Thatcher, sought to deploy a new generation of theater nuclear missiles in Europe to counter the new Soviet SS-22 nuclear missiles. Many Europeans feared that their countries were in danger of becoming the battleground of a limited nuclear war fought between the United States and the USSR. The Grenham Women's Peace Camp movement mobilized thousands of protesters, mostly women and children, in an effort to surround the U.S. base and prevent the cruise missiles from being deployed. Thus began the longest continuous mass peace protest in history that eventually prevented the missiles from being fully deployed. The Women's Peace Camp at Grenham Common, England, claimed that they were being attacked by U.S. electronic weapons from within the U.S. air base there. They believed that some form of electromagnetic wave or some other signal was being directed at them and responsible for a number of illnesses they suffered over the years. Symptoms ranged from mild headaches and drowsiness to bouts of temporary paralysis, and in one case an apparent circulatory failure which required emergency treatment. The women complained of sharp pains and problems with speech and coordination. A team of doctors from the Medical Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons compiled a report on the condition of the women. The women first noticed a pattern of illness that emerged in 1984. They discounted food and water poisoning as causes and suspected interference from inside the base. The doctors found that the women at different points around the camp appeared to have experienced similar symptoms at the same time, even though they were not in contact with one another. They believed that there was a deliberate intent to make life difficult for them and to drive them away from their protest. Some of the worst affected women now find it impossible to stay around the air base for more than a short period of time. The women at Grenham Commons suspected that more than one type of frequency of radiation was being used against them, and said that the symptoms varied from time to time and seemed to reflect what was taking place on the base. Large numbers of women have complained of sudden feelings of extreme tiredness shortly before major events such as the departure of cruise missile convoys and other occasions when their activities and protests may have proved awkward for the forces using the base. Electronics Today conducted a number of tests around the base in cooperation with journalists from other organizations, and the readings taken with a wide-range signal strength meter showed sharp increases in the background signal level near one of the women's camps at a time when they claimed to be experiencing ill effects. On another occasion, previously low signal levels near the camp rose sharply when the women created a disturbance just outside the perimeter fence of the base. Whether this had indicated an attempt to subdue the women by electronic means, or was merely the use of radar system surveillance, is impossible to say. The signal levels measured were well above normal background levels, but still within official safety limits. However, there is evidence from a number of sources that low levels of electromagnetic radiation can have harmful effects, especially when exposure takes place over a long period of time. British defense officials denied that there was any form of electric signal being used against the protesters. Kim Beasley of the Grenham Common Women's Peace Camp has compiled a fairly extensive catalog of effects that have resulted from low-frequency signals emanating from the U.S. base, apparently targeted at the women protesters. These include vertigo, retinal bleeding, burnt face even at night, nausea, sleep disturbances, palpitations, loss of concentration, loss of memory, disorientation, severe headaches, temporary paralysis, faulty speech coordination, irritability, and a sense of panic in non-panic situations. Identical and similar effects have been reported elsewhere and appear to be fairly commonplace amongst so-called victims. Many of these symptoms seem to be associated in medical literature with exposure to microwaves, and especially through low-intensity or non-thermal exposure. These effects have been reviewed by Dr. Robert Becker, twice nominated for the Nobel Prize, and a specialist in electromagnetic effects. His report confirms that the symptoms mirror those he would expect to see had microwaves been deployed and tested upon large numbers of people. In September of 1998, a lawsuit brought by the International Committee on Offensive Microwave Weapons was dismissed in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. Quote, "We were asking the court to enforce a presidential memorandum which bans involuntary research on human subjects," said the group's director, Harlan Gerard. The Philadelphia-based organization had alleged that the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency have conducted such experiments in their efforts to develop weapons systems using electromagnetic frequencies, lasers, microwaves, and sound waves. The judge ruled that the group did not have standing to bring suit because the people alleged to have suffered from such testing were not members of Harlan Gerard's organization. The judge acknowledged that Gerard himself was a member, but stated that his own complaints were, quote, "too generalized and nonspecific to support a complaint," unquote. Gerard stated that his organization could not afford an appeal, and he said The committee plans to raise the matter with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. A new report from the Coalition Against Torture and Racial Discrimination, an alliance of 15 U.S. human rights groups, states that Harlan Gerard's lawsuit deserves closer attention. Quote, "Given the past history of secret experimentation by the government," the anti-torture group declares, "these allegations of continuing and ongoing government-sponsored human testing using electromagnetic weapons and radio frequency weapons should not be dismissed without more thorough, impartial investigation." Unquote.
Jean Manning is a journalist who stumbled into a strange world when she started asking questions about alternative energy sources and heard the story of an early 20th century inventor named Nikola Tesla.
Tesla is almost a cult hero and an overlooked genius, and he has so many inventions that are at the basis of technologies that we have today.
She went to a conference on Tesla and had a close encounter with a mysterious scientific researcher who became her deep throat, her Mr. X.
He sent me a file of materials about the Bernard Eastlund patent.
About a month ago, the U.S. Patent Office granted a patent to a Houston-based scientist, Dr. Bernard Eastlund, for an invention which Dr. Eastlund says could be used to change the weather. Dr. Eastlund says the invention could also be used to disrupt communications all over the world and might be used to destroy or deflect a missile attack.
The Eastlund patents had the ring of the mad scientist aspect of Tesla. Tesla talked about this Tesla shield around the planet and talked about particle beam weaponry, something called a death ray.
Death ray? Jean wasn't sure where all this was leading until Mr. X called again.
And he said, the maniacs are actually going to do it up in Alaska.
Mr. X's maniacs were in the U.S. Pentagon, and he was convinced they were conspiring to build Bernard Eastlund's Sky Zapper under the guise of a nice little research project deep in the Alaskan bush called HAARP.
The basic concept is to build a very large antenna, then to utilize a large amount of power and to beam those radio waves up into the upper atmosphere.
Have you approached the Pentagon with this invention?
Yes, and what I'm not at liberty to tell you is the details of what that interaction has been.
The word spread through the Alaskan bush, and soon a band of suspicious Alaskans set out to warn people about what they saw as the U.S. military's secret agenda.
And what you have with HAARP is sort of the universal hammer for geophysical warfare.
Nick Begich is the chief conspiracy theorist.
So when did you know that you were onto something?
I think as soon as I saw the references to Tesla's work, and when I read Bernard Eastlund's original patents, I realized that what we really had here in Alaska was a prototype for a ground-based Star Wars weapon system.
HARP is a non-classified project run not by Bernard Eastland, but by the U.S. Army and Navy. The official HARP story is told by one man, John Heckscher.
It consists of several types of transmitting instruments and numerous scientific instruments that study the natural ionosphere and the ionosphere that has been perturbed by the instruments that we are building.
The ionosphere is a sea of electrically charged particles in the upper atmosphere, and the instrument is a powerful radio wave transmitter.
Does it have any military applications?
The site itself is strictly a scientific research site. Perhaps the outcome of some of the science, perhaps some of the results could be applied in a to military systems.
Just a little physics project? Jim Roderick isn't buying it. He's been gunning for the real goods on HARP, and his weapon is the internet.
The military is incapable of doing pure science. Science is conducted by them for application in weapon systems, for no other reasons.
From his shack in the middle of an Alaskan village, Jim and his co-conspirators around the globe have been tapping into databases. They've dredged up hundreds of long-buried scientific reports and even some internal documents from the military. They call it the world's first techno-protest, and they did it all on the military's own baby, the net.
Plans for HARP activities correlate with projections of what can be done in the Eastland patents. It's that simple.
So it's not a coincidence?
It's not a coincidence.
Well, I hate to disagree with you, but it's not his patent that we're building. Superficially, yes, they send energy up into the ionosphere, but the Eastland patents require huge, prodigious, in fact, amounts of power, like 100 billion watts.
Remember that number, 100 billion watts. You'll hear it again later.
HARP requires only 3 million watts.
There is a paper trail leading us back to Eastland.
No, there is not. There is no paper trail that I'm aware of that's leading back to Eastland. Eastland used to be an employee of the company which is building HARP, but that's pure coincidence.
Is it also a coincidence that the tiny company that owned Eastland's patents was later swallowed up by an enormous military intelligence firm called E-Systems?
$2.1 billion in annual sales, 1.8 billion of that, with a B, was to military intelligence groups, CIA, NSA, and others. And of that, 800 million were black projects, so secret that even the United States Congress didn't know what they were.
E-Systems was then swallowed up by Raytheon Corporation. It too specializes in super secret contracts with the Pentagon.
Why would Raytheon be so excited about this? Well, it's a ground-based Star Wars weapon prototype. For them, it represents potentially billions and billions of dollars.
So how would you describe this world of E-Systems and Raytheon and HARP?
Dark.
There's a lot of people around here that have a really lot of strange ideas, and I think many of them are pretty bizarre.
Michelle Angbritson keeps the HARP computers from freezing up in between visits from the military scientists.
Do you know, do you understand what they're doing here when the scientists come in?
You mean when the scientists come in and shoot the beams up? Yeah, they're shooting the beams up, and I think that heats a little small space in the ionosphere, and then you've got guys that are sitting on computers, and you've got people putting up weather poles that measure weather and everything like that. I mean, there's something spooky going on here.
There have been claims made by some scientists that that you could heat up the ionosphere and affect local weather.
If you were to do Eastland patents, I have no doubt that's the case.
Claims are being made that it could disrupt global communications.
Global?
That it could shut down another country's communication system and enhance your own.
Not HARP. Not HARP in
as it is
Alaska.
now.
No.
But you couldn't disable any systems?
Those that use, if the systems used a path which was accessible to the HAARP beam, yes.
Starting to sound like Eastland's invention to you? Well, remember, John Heckscher says HAARP has nowhere near the power levels Eastland talked about.
It seems like this entire thing has been a matter of disinformation.
Eric Nashland understands the military. He spent 15 years in the service as a radio engineer. He knows deception.
It came to our attention that there was a document, a technical memorandum, I think it was 195 or something like that. And reading right in the front of it, they said that, bottom line, although this is here, it does not constitute publication.
It doesn't exist.
It basically doesn't exist. So it was kind of like, wow, here's the document that doesn't exist. And we're talking several hundred pages of document that, you know, doesn't exist on a project that is completely unclassified and open to the public.
We got it through friendly folks in the right spots, but it really lays out, these are notes from a conference that really break down where they were going to use this technology and how this technology was going to be applied.
Remember the 100 billion watts debate? Well, for Nick Begich, this document was pay dirt.
And in the document that we uncovered, the actual desired level of these researchers is 100 billion watts, and there we're talking something closer to the order of what Bernard Eastland envisioned.
You must be familiar with Technical Memorandum 195, which talks about a desired level of 100 billion watts.
Which memorandum?
Technical Memorandum 195.
I'm not familiar with that number.
Well, it's about 600 pages. And it's, I mean, you may not acknowledge it because it hasn't been published, but it exists. I've seen it.
I don't know what Technical Memorandum 195 is, because I haven't seen it.
This is a published document. It's non-released. And it's the word games that John Heckscher plays and the word games the United States military plays, and it's the word games they continue to play, and those are the things that need to end.
Zap incoming missiles, disrupt global communications, and engineer the weather. And ready? There's one more. Some people believe the technology being tested here could be used for sinister projects involving humans. Radio waves messing around with people's brain waves. And guess what? The military denies this one, too.
The human mind is subject to being affected by radio frequency energy, and that's what this device is.
In other words, you can move the moods of large populations using this kind of technology.
So now we have not just maniacs in the Pentagon, but a bunch of Dr. Strangeloves? Pretty weird stuff. But scientists have been experimenting with radio frequencies on animals' brains for decades. And the military has followed it all very closely, especially once it found out the Russians were onto it.
It was all kept a deep, dark secret by the two superpowers.
Back in the 60s, the Soviets began zapping the American embassy in Moscow with a low-frequency beam. No one knows for sure what they were up to, but one theory is that they were trying to mess with people's central nervous systems. And one report did say the diplomats got depressed a lot. And hey, just think of all the nifty applications against the enemy. Why blow people up when you can drive them crazy?
From documents dating back into the early 80s, we see that the military had discussed the possibilities of mind control through radio frequency energy. The possibility is there. The military has studied it.
A 1982 Air Force report called radio frequency energy a major new research initiative and said that RF can, quote, disrupt normal purposeful behavior. A 1987 military report called for more research on RF energy as a non